Support for On Being with Krista Tippett comes from the Fetzer Institute. Fetzer supports a movement of organizations that are applying spiritual solutions to society's toughest problems. Learn more at fetzer.org.
I'm Krista Tippett. Up next, my extended conversation with poet and chronicler of communal remembering, Clint Smith. There is a shorter, produced version of this conversation wherever you found this podcast. Clint, do you have any questions for me before we start?
I don't think so. Okay. Except I'm one of those people. What do they say? Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Oh, that's nice. So, well, that makes me happy. Really happy.
Yeah, it's a wonderful show.
Thank you. Well, I don't want to say anything until we start. Okay.
All right. My name is Clint Smith. I'm sitting here with my 3 books.
That's good. No, that's good.
All right.
So one thing I want to share with you is that I think the producer you've been dealing with is Kayla Edwards, and you probably haven't made this connection, but she was the opinion section editor of the Davidson newspaper, like you.
Oh, wow.
I think you met her a couple of years ago and took a picture and shared it on Twitter. Anyway.
I remember that.
Do you?
Oh,
yeah.
my gosh.
And I asked her, she said, because she put this in the prep, and I said, did you tell him? Did you remind him? She said, no. So I want you to know that as we start.
And now she works for you all.
Yeah, and she's on this line somewhere. Yeah.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
Hello. Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, I got such a kick out of that. I think that was maybe like 5 or 6 years ago now.
Yeah, I think that I couldn't find the tweet anymore, but yeah, it feels like a nice personal connection here. And so she's excited and we're all excited. So I think, I never quite know what the shape of an interview will be until I actually do the prep, even though I might think I know. And this time, something really emerged that may be a little different from what I thought or from what you've done before. But I hope we can have a little adventure here. I will
follow you wherever we go.
Okay. So, I mean, as you know, basically what we do is our lens on everything is the human condition, and then we can pick up any subject and look at it in that way. And we just started this, we went off the radio last year, so now we're doing 2 podcast seasons a year, and we just started the second one. And we're kind of having this twin. So one of the things I'm interested in and what we're circling around is how this moment in the life of the world is calling us to get more conscious and claim the fullness of what it means to be human and of our agency as human beings. And that has been coming at us in all the reckonings that have just become more insistent and existential. And also, I think this new AI and the way our lives with technology is evolving also can be a thing that just really presses us to a new kind of clarity about what it means to be human and how we want to live and who we will be to each other and what we want for all of our children. And I think it gets at, can we get a new kind of clarity on the fullest meaning of intelligence in human life, and also how embodied that is, which is something that is not actually accessible to AI, and even the physicality of memory and language. And I feel like this is something that is so vibrant in all of your work, in how you go about your research and how you write. This connection between language and words and physicality and place and the body, and also how poetry distinctively gets at this. So I think I'm kind of first and foremost speaking to you as a poet and seeing how that sensibility, as well as a way with words, really infuses everything you do, including how you write about history. And yeah, so how does that sound? I will lead, but I hope you're up for that.
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, and I feel like you've kept working with this in different aspects of your life that I almost started to think of as kind of different laboratories for investigation. So a high school classroom, prisons, our communal reckoning around the history of this country, our history of slavery, our racial present. And I feel like your contribution to that is kind of consistently transcending this realm of arguments and mere idea and kind of calling us back into our bodies, into something that can be lived and breathed and moved forward. And so one thing I want to do also is just occasionally ask you to read a poem.
Mm-hmm.
And also if as we're speaking or as I ask you to read something, if there's something that comes to you that you'd like to read, I just welcome you to bring that forward. Okay.
Quick logistics
Yeah,
question.
absolutely.
I know that you've historically had the sort of radio version and then the unabridged version.
Yeah.
Is that still a thing? Or like, I guess how embedded within that question is how should I, like if I flub a poem and will it be edited? And if I start over or how does that work?
No, it's edited. Okay. Yeah, we don't, we've been released from the public radio clock, which is very restrictive and had us kind of to the nanosecond every time.
Got it.
So sometimes we're just editing longer, but yeah, we have a high aesthetic here, so, so we will make things beautiful. And right. So don't worry about flubbing or starting over or being nonlinear.
Sounds good.
Okay. So, well, first of all, it's wonderful to speak with you. I'm so happy to have you here.
It's a real pleasure.
And you, very importantly, were born and raised in New Orleans. And then very dramatically, was it your senior year in high school that Hurricane Katrina happened?
It was 3 days into my senior year of high school.
3 days, okay. So, I mean, one thing that strikes me when I'm thinking about that is you had this experience of extreme ecological catastrophe and sudden displacement, and yet that phenomenon is something that's going to be ever more ordinary in our world. But I kind of have this picture of you, 3 days into your senior year, in this place where you and your family were so rooted. And then you end up in Houston in a new world and new school at that moment in your life when we're all on a kind of cusp of catharsis anyway. I don't know. I know sometimes you invoke physics and you're as interested in those things as I am. It almost feels like you kind of stepped into this multiverse version of what your life might have been. I wonder how that felt to you, that drama.
Yeah, I think in so many ways I'm still sort of understanding and unpacking the sort of repercussions and implications of what Katrina meant in my own life, in the life of my family, in the life of my city. And I just recently turned 35. Hurricane Katrina was when I was 17. So this past year, I had been thinking a lot about how it sort of bifurcated my life, and that it was half a lifetime ago that I was displaced in that way. And I think having been removed from New Orleans so suddenly, so unexpectedly, so violently, in many ways, what I do think it did was sort of give me a deeper appreciation for the way that the sensibilities of New Orleans, the texture of New Orleans, the culture of New Orleans remained a part of me, even when I felt as if, even when I didn't know it was still a part of me, because it felt like I never got almost a sense of closure. Like my group of friends and I from high school will talk often about just like what our senior year would have been or could have been. Right. It's the culmination of this lifetime of childhood memories and opportunities, and it kind of it felt like we were moving into our fullest selves, that we had a sort of more grounded sense of who we were, who we wanted to be. Again, your senior year is supposed to be this sort of culmination of all that came before, and we never got to live that in that way. And so I do think sometimes about what, you mentioned the sort of multiverse. Sometimes I imagine what an alternative reality in which there was no Katrina, what what sort of shape my life would have taken on. And it's obviously impossible to know, but it is something I sort of think about, not with any sort of regret, mostly with just a sense of curiosity.
Mm-hmm. I actually want to, at the end, I mean, you continue to write about this. So clearly, as you say, it's something that's with you. And I suspect that you'll be processing it for all of your days. And I think I want to, and you have written two volumes of poetry. I think near the end, I want you to read one of the newer poems you've written about Katrina. But one thing that's interesting to me is you've also written essays about it. But I think that in this story, this part of you is such an amazing example of how much poetry can convey in so few words. So I was wondering if you might read this poem from Counting Descent, which is on page 45, on observing my home after the storm. Again, like you wrote an article called Strangers in Our Home, Why Writing About Hurricane Katrina is Both Impossible and Necessary. And somehow this poem gets at so much of that. Would you kind of set the scene for this poem?
It's so interesting to return to sort of old collections and old work, and to think about, where you were when you wrote this. I wrote so many of these poems over a decade ago, and I can't remember the last time I read this poem either to myself or out loud. But when we returned to my home in New Orleans for the first time, it was in October, I believe, October or November, following the storm that had happened in August. And, for weeks, for months, 80% of the city had been underwater. And our home was included in that. I remember sitting on the couch in my aunt and uncle's house in Houston, Texas, watching as the grocery store we went to, the church we went to, the school I went to, seeing images of these places under 8, 9, 10, 11 feet of water. And, spending weeks imagining what the inside of my own home would have looked like. And we eventually went when it became clear that we wouldn't be returning in any meaningful way. But as soon as the water receded, we did go back to see what we could retrieve, if anything. And I just always remember, we were wearing these almost sort of what felt to me like chemical suits, almost as if, as if I was watching myself in a sort of zombie apocalypse sort of experience with the mask and everything. But I'll always remember that smell. I think that memory is a funny thing. And I think that, so much of my memory is also tied to pictures that we have. And, there's one photo of a chair in our dining room hanging from the chandelier in our dining room. And that sort of, I think, represents and embodies the chaos that existed. But you opened the door and there was mold everywhere. And, our home had been sitting in 10 feet of water, and, kitchen plates, china that have been part of our family are sort of broken in pieces across the floor. There's mold growing across the wall. And the smell just kind of, I think it took me a few minutes before I was able to actually step inside, because it was so pungent. It was so forceful, almost as if somebody was, like an invisible hand was pushing me out of the door. And so, writing for me is and always has been an attempt to sort of capture a moment in time, to capture a feeling, capture an observation, capture a conversation, that serve as a sort of time capsule that allows me to remember who I've been, what I've seen, who I have been in relationship to the world around me. And this poem is an attempt to have done so. On observing my home after the storm. 1. The smell, so pungent you can see it, the fermentation of sky prickling at your skin. an alloy of brackish and sewer water stinging nostrils, the residue of cries for help. Eyes unprepared for this sort of wreckage. The maggots demarcate the space between what was and what never will be again. Steel door hinges split at the seam. Every wall, a groundswell of lusterless green. Glass has meandered across the floor, a cacophony of shattered skin. The overturned dinner table sits on its side, as if to protect the rest of the house from the night it knows will come. The floorboards do not creak. They whimper, distraught by all they could not prevent. 2. But what are these words but an empty lyric? What then is anything beyond the language we give it? What else do we have to describe the carnage we see, but all that is woefully inadequate?
You know, that line, that question, and of course poetry is such a wonderful container for questions. What then is anything beyond the language we give it? That is such a striking question, and I just wonder, like, what does that question mean to you? How do you start to answer it?
I think it's something I sort of wrestle with, all the time. As I said, sort of writing is almost an act of mindfulness for me. It's an act of being present, with my memories, of being present with that which is in front of me, and attempting to use language as a way to sort of home in on the specificity, on the granularity, on the minutia, the specific texture of what a feeling is, what a moment is, what an observation is. And at the same time, sort of wrestling with if that very act if the act of writing about such an image or such a memory can ever be commensurate with the image or memory or feeling itself. And I think it's something that I'm interested in, both in the context of language, but also in the context of art. And a lot of my sort of nonfiction work, my journalistic work, I've been thinking a lot about monuments and memorials and museums. And I think in a similar way, one of the questions that sort of undergird my exploration and examination of these spaces is if, a memorial to a tragedy, a monument to an act of violence, if those things can ever capture the horror and the violence and the distress and the despair that it is attempting to remember, or if it is inevitably never going to do so. And I think, whether it be sort of visual art, whether it be language, I'm always interested in the extent to which our efforts to remember our past, our efforts to understand what we see in front of us, if those attempts at language or attempts at art can never fully capture what these things are, what these things have been. And I don't know that they can, but I also don't know that means that we stop trying.
If I think about some of the different places you've inhabited in your professional life, and if I think about them as kind of laboratories where you're working through some of these questions that you've already been surfacing, you're becoming a high school teacher. Feels like it continues to be something that is just absolutely central to your identity, how it kind of set you off on everything you did after that. And I wonder, I would love for you to just introduce Paulo Freire to those of us who is a Brazilian educator and philosopher who's really formative in I think a way of, not just thinking about educating, but thinking about life and everything you continued to have continued to do. What was that formation for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on. Being a high school English teacher is it helped shape everything for me. I mean, I wouldn't be a writer. at least not in the way that I am. I wouldn't think about my work, what my sort of responsibilities are, what my commitments are, what the sort of ethics of my work should look like. Being a high school teacher shaped everything. I mean, I feel very lucky to read and write and think and for a living. But man, like sitting in a high school classroom with a bunch of teenagers and just talking about books was the best job I ever had. It was so fulfilling. It was so remarkable to sit with a group of 15 and 16-year-olds talking about the way that a book is in conversation with the various facets of their own lives, and to see that could serve as an entry point for them to understand the way that their lives are in conversation with one another in ways that might have never been possible without that text, in ways that might have never been possible without that one sentence in that one paragraph that that one student pointed out in a way that illuminated something for everybody else in that classroom. Those specific moments of magic were so, I mean, there's nothing like it. And I think that is one of the remarkable things about teaching. And one of the remarkable things about teaching that age group of young people who are sort of coming into themselves and developing a more acute, a fuller, more nuanced sense of the world around them. And Paulo Freire, he is a Brazilian scholar and educator who, as you say, was incredibly formative for me. I read his book, perhaps his most popular text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And the essence of that book is thinking about how part of the role of education is to help people who have been subjected to violence, who have been subjected to oppression, who have been subjected to despair or resource extraction at the hands of the state, at the hands of their government, how education can be a way to help them understand that the world is social construction, and thus can be reconstructed and deconstructed and made into something new, and that the reality of the world around us is not an inevitability.
Right.
It is the result of decisions that have been made, often by people in power, often by people who look a certain way or move in a certain way or speak in a certain way or have access to certain resources that they prevent others from having access to. And that is what shapes the material landscape that we all move through. And that once you understand that, part of what Freire talks about is it helps disabuse you of the idea that your station in life is something that is sort of inevitably a facet of who you are, but rather as the result of decisions that have been made over generations, over decades, over centuries. And for me, that idea is so freeing. It's so profound. Because I remember being a kid growing up in New Orleans in the 80s and 90s and just being inundated with messages about all the things that were wrong with Black people. And that, the reason New Orleans had so much crime and so much poverty and so much violence and so many people in prison were because of things that were wrong with Black people and things that Black people had failed to do. And I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to say it was wrong. I didn't have the language. I didn't have the toolkit. I didn't have the historical context with which to push back against it. And as a result, I think part of what happened is I began to sort of internalize these messages. And because when somebody keeps telling you something about yourself or your community and you don't have the language with which to push back against it, it can be there was a sense of paralysis almost. And it wasn't until I read certain books and was introduced to certain art and watched certain films or documentaries and studies that helped, again, disabuse me of this idea that there was something inherent to any community that made their position static, but that instead the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is not because of the people in those communities, but because of what has been done to those communities, generation after generation after generation. And I knew the way that books had freed me in that way. And I wanted to bring that to my students to the extent that I could. I taught in Prince George's County, Maryland, a school that was, predominantly Black and Latino, a school that was predominantly students on free and reduced lunch, students who were undocumented, students who were in and out of the criminal legal system. And I wanted the conversations we had in our class and the books we read and the lessons we collectively learned to help them understand that the reason their communities look the way that they did, again, were not inevitable, but were the result of decisions that people had made.
And also just, I feel like what's coming through here is, language as more than mere words, right? Language as power, right? To have the language to name something or not to have it is also about how one can move through the world and move the world. You've written and spoken about an interesting kind of transition you made. Following on how that approach you were taking to seeing the world that your students inhabited and how it constricted them. And you've talked about how you, for a while, you wanted to go head on to the issues, to these societal problems and these societal constructions, and you started to find that actually wasn't the way, or the only way for them to do the work to actually step into that agency. Like you've talked, you said, let's see, what you talked about. You found that you had to actually draw out their identities, and that for them to, you said, in order to do the work of understanding what you're politically committed to, you have to understand who and what you are committed to as a person. And you use some interesting language that demands a sort of stealth reflexivity and a lot of identity work. Would you say some more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think another way of putting that is that I came in real hot.
Okay.
I read a lot of Paulo Freire, and I was this young 22-year-old teacher, and I came into my 10th grade English class, and I think I was so committed to going in and immediately sort of creating this classroom of like freedom fighters and revolutionaries who were gonna look around their school and their community and see things that were wrong, and they were gonna be marching, and they were gonna be picketing, and they were gonna be leading demonstrations and rallies, and they were gonna develop this sense of their political the political landscape around them, and march to Capitol Hill, and change the political landscape of Prince George's County in Maryland and the whole country. And I think I came, I remember there was this moment where my students were walking into the classroom on the first day, and everybody sat down, and I went to the board, and I very dramatically grabbed a piece of chalk. I think I had watched like too many Denzel Washington movies. Okay. And I grabbed this piece of chalk and I wrote on the board, mass incarceration, school to prison pipeline, immigration reform, climate change, and just kept writing all these different things. And then I turned around and I put the chalk on very dramatically, kind of threw it on the ground. And I was like, this year, we're going to solve all that. Okay. And they just looked at me and were like, man, where's the worksheet? What are you talking about? Who is this kid who's not that many years older than us in here doing a terrible Denzel Washington impression? And I think that was the beginning of me realizing that these kids are kids, and which is to say that they're human, and they are full of complexity and a three-dimensionality, and that they are not simply avatars of political ideology, or they are not simply people who will look at an issue and see it exactly in the same way that I do. And so I think that part of what I realized as I wrote there was that I had to step back, and before books and literature and history could be used as a way to politicize or radicalize young people, that books had the opportunity to help young people understand who they were.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, and whatever comes after that is what will come, right? Because part of what I learned is that is my job in that classroom. My job was to bring literature and to bring ideas across, contemporary literature, sort of literature of the past, and to put it in front of them to help guide them and facilitate conversations around these books that help them better understand who they were in relationship to the world that is in front of them, in relationship to their history, and in relationship to the future that they want to step into and the future they want to build. And the sort of sense of a political identity is merely one part of a much broader, ecosystem of the self that would develop over the course of, our time together and obviously throughout the course of their lives.
There's such wisdom in that and intelligence, right? About not how we want to be able to teach or to think that we grow or we can help other people grow, but how it actually works. One thing, I'm impatient in our culture a bit with this kind of pedestal that telling a story is up on. And yet what you're talking about is drawing forth the story and the question of so what, right? The story and then the ability to think in a more complex and conscious way about so what, that in relationship to the world, right? And there's so much in what you just said that could be learned in terms of how we culturally are about advocacy and, arguing for things or against things. And kind of getting at this idea of like, what is intelligence and what is education and, how do we learn and grow and what the point of that is, right? All of this was kind of brewing in this story. And then, so you ended up taking yourself out of the classroom into graduate school. But my sense is as much to live more fully into what that was teaching you and calling you to. And then also what interests me is when you did go to graduate school, and you went to graduate school at Harvard, I feel like you there had this pull back to needing to have your hands and your heart in life, real life on the ground. And then you also started teaching in prisons. Is that a fair encapsulation of that particular pivot?
Yeah. So I was in the classroom and part of what I kept thinking about was the sort of larger landscape of social and historical and economic realities that shape the lives of my students. I realized that my school, the school where I taught, and any school, is merely one island in a sort of much longer and larger archipelago that shaped how my students move through the world, and it is an essential space, and it is an incredibly formative space. But I also wanted to gain a deeper understanding for myself about the sort of interconnectedness of all of those different parts of the sort of social ecosystem. And I wanted to understand, particularly in more depth, the relationship between our education system and our prison system. And so I went to graduate school, and it's interesting because my entire graduate school experience was very animated by the Black Lives Matter movement. And that's in part because the same week that I started grad school, Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson.
Yeah.
And so in those, that first year and that second year, and the sort of what felt like a sort of an endless cascade of images and videos that so many of us remember, of people being killed at the hands of police, at people being killed at the hands of vigilante, at people being brutalized in front of us in a way that perhaps had never gained so much consistent social and political traction. I was there, and I was sitting in the library for 12 hours a day, as PhD students do, and I was reading these books that sort of explained and gave historical context to help understand why so much of what we were seeing happen in front of us was happening. Like, what are the judicial, the legislative, the public policy realities that sort of are undergirding so much of the unrest that was bubbling at the surface. And I also came to realize that I'm someone who, unless I am placing myself in proximity to the thing that I am studying and thinking about, then I can lose touch with the humanity of it. I can lose touch with the urgency of it. And so for me, if I'm sitting around, studying prisons and studying racism and studying inequality, studying mass incarceration, but not making myself proximate to incarcerated people, then it can very quickly become an intellectual exercise, not in any sort of malevolent sort of way, but just, you sit around reading Michel Foucault all day, but don't spend time in conversation with people who are actually suffering at the hands of the system that he describes, then I just didn't want to live only in the world of theory and ideas. I wanted to, place my feet in those spaces. And so I started teaching at a prison in Massachusetts. And, it was the most important thing that I did, I think, in my entire graduate school experience.
How would you talk about how that further deepened and nuanced your understanding of what intelligence and education are and what they are for? How we seek knowledge and learn and grow, and what is the point of that?
So the first group of folks I worked with when I was teaching at the prison were a group of men who were serving life sentences without parole. And it was the first time I'd ever been in an adult prison. I had been in some juvenile detention facilities before. I'd done some writing and poetry workshops. But I'd never been inside of an adult prison and spent time with people who were currently incarcerated in said prison. And I kind of mentioned this before in the context of my students, and I feel like this is a recurring theme in my life and emerges in much of my work. But you're just reminded of the three-dimensionality and the complexity and the humanity of people, and that the men I was working with were fathers and sons and brothers and husbands and friends, and that they were some of them were incredibly funny, some of them were incredibly serious, some of them were incredibly brilliant, just brilliant. But I also think that some of them, that they were people who had done things or made mistakes that remind all of us of the messiness of what it means to be human. And almost all of them grew up in situations that were shaped by poverty, that were shaped by violence. And one of the things I kept thinking about the whole time I was in there was like, but for the arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance, it very easily could have been me inside of this prison rather than somebody who gets to walk in and out of it with a notebook to teach a class, right? It was very clear to me in the stories that they told about their lives and the things that they wrote about their lives, that had I been born into similar circumstances that some of these men had been born into, it would have been very difficult for me not to come in contact with the criminal legal system. It would have been very difficult for me not to experience a sense of fear that creates a sense of desperation. It would have been very difficult for me not to be, to bear witness to a sense of incessant violence that that social scientists tell us impacts the sort of brain chemistry of young people. And so, and that's not to say, I want to be clear that it's not to say that there is an inevitable trajectory for young people who grow up in poverty or in situations surrounded by violence. That's not the case. But it is important for us to take seriously the way that so many people who end up in prison are growing up in scenarios and are growing up in circumstances that are shaped by those realities. And I think it was just really humbling for me. And it was an important reminder, again, of the sort of the way that birth and circumstance and things that are beyond our control, things that are beyond our decisions, shape the trajectory of our lives. And that reminder, I think for me, kept allowed there to remain a sense of urgency to the academic work that I was doing, the scholarly work that I was doing, and a sense of responsibility, as someone who could have been in that scenario, but was not. What responsibility do I have to sort of examine the carceral landscape that they are a part of, and also to bring attention to the stories and the complexities of who these men are, which isn't to say that they are perfect, because they're not, because none of us are perfect. No. But to talk about who they are and the stories they tell me as a way to remind folks that these are not, that folks in prisons are not monsters or are not, as Brian Stevenson always talks about, how people are not and should not be defined by the worst thing they've ever done.
Yeah.
And that's what that experience did for me.
And I think also at a place like Harvard, and a lot of the way school is conceived of in the U.S., the purpose of learning and education is towards this trajectory forward, right? And so you're teaching, you were teaching people who might never move beyond those walls. But there's something even talking about people growing up in an atmosphere of fear, which led to despair, is to pay an appropriate reverence to the power of fear in the human body, which we're learning by way of science. That's not just an idea. How did you think about the value of education in a context like that, which was not going to lead to the kind of trajectory, which is always just so fanciful and right, illusory in many ways, and and even just intelligence, what that means in that kind of life.
Yeah, and this is what I ended up writing my dissertation about. Thinking about what does education mean to someone who was told as a child that they were going to spend the rest of their life in prison. For those who might not be familiar, the United States is the only country in the world that sentences children to life without the possibility of parole.
Yeah.
While mandatory life without parole has been rendered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, life without parole still exists as an option. And there are thousands of people who are incarcerated across this country who were sentenced to life without parole as children. And so, for me, I was thinking a lot about, and it began when I was, spending time with these men who were in their, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And you're looking around and you see these men who've been in prison since they were 15, 16, 17 years old and who have been offered no, for so long, who were offered no opportunity to ever be released. And so I was interested in this idea, well, what motivates someone to learn? Like, what motivates someone to read poetry, to write a novel, to learn geometry, to learn physics, to get a degree? What motivates people to do so, even when and you alluded to this, like the ostensible, the sort of social utilities that we often associate education with. You get the degree so that you can get a good job, so that you can buy a house and a car and feed your family and, go on vacation. And, when those things are stripped away from you, what is the thing that motivates people? And as you can imagine, it's, people are not homogenous, and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And in my conversations and research, I discovered that there were a range of motivations for folks. But one thing that was interesting, and maybe that I didn't expect, was that so many of these folks that I spent time with and observed and interviewed, they still, even in the face of, constitutional realities that told them something different, still believed that there was the chance that they might get out of prison one day. And they had to hold on to this sense of hope. They had to hold on to this, even, this 0.0001% possibility that they might get out one day. And so part of what initially motivates people to participate in some of these prison education programs is, and some of the programs, and I'm defining education broadly here, because there's, programs where you can get a degree, and then there's programs where you can learn a trade, and programs. But what is true is that the people who ultimately are pardoned or have their sentence commuted by a governor, or who do get out, whether it's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, are the people who participated in those programs as a way to demonstrate that they remained committed, remained motivated, that they have a certain set of skills that could be used as justification for them upon release. But the problem is that happens so rarely. But even if it happened to 1 out of 1,000 incarcerated people, you had to believe that you could be that one. Right. Because that is what sustains you. Because otherwise it becomes difficult. But what's interesting is that is the motivation of so many of them when they were young men, right? And they were, if you're 17, 18 years old, you're like, I just need to figure out how I can get out of here. And so they start participating in these programs. And then what happens as they begin to participate in these programs is that it doesn't not become about hoping to get out one day, but it also becomes about the experience of, like, learning itself and the experience of education, sometimes for the first time in many of these guys' lives, being used as a way to better understand who you are in relationship to the world. Right, there it is.
It's that same place you found you had to take your high school students.
Exactly.
It's who you are. Okay.
Exactly.
There's so much to talk about. I want to talk about how the word was passed. Where again, we've been talking about word and body and language and who you are and story and how all of that is intertwined. And one of the kind of distinctive contributions of this book, I mean, I don't know that I saw this word used, but to me, it's kind of a pilgrimage that you took to places. And you mentioned monuments a little while ago, and it was kind of sparked, it kind of gestated in your mind as statues started coming down, which were, symbolic, and of course not just symbolic, but these physical things. And So this was really a pilgrimage, it was about history, but it was about standing on certain ground, right? It was about being physically present to it. And I was so interested to find that. Well, first of all, would you talk about this phrase, how the word was passed, where that came from, why that is the title of the book?
Yeah, I think maybe for some context for folks, it might be helpful to understand that the origin story for this book was in 2017 when I watched several Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans, statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And as I was watching these statues come down, I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And thinking about, well, what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. Yeah. That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. That my parents still live on a street named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people. Because, the thing is that we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols, but are reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy. And public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives, which doesn't mean that if you just take down a statue of Robert E. Lee or erase the racial wealth gap, or you change the name of a Jefferson Davis sign, you create more economically egalitarian schools. But I think it does help us understand the ways that certain communities have been harmed throughout American history, and helps us understand how certain stories are told through the images and the narratives that are represented and embodied.
And therefore the import of starting to shift those.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And so I did I had this moment where I was like, I am the descendant of enslaved people. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. I grew up in a city that was the heart of the domestic slave trade. And I don't know enough about the history of slavery in a way that feels commensurate to the impact and legacy that it's had on this country. And so I did feel like I had to go on a sort of pilgrimage. I wanted to go visit monuments and memorials and museums and cemeteries and prisons and these places that told the story of this history in their bars, in their soil, in the buildings that still stood from that period of time. And so, I traveled across the country, visiting all of these different places and examining to what extent these places were reckoning with that history, to what extent they were failing to reckon with that history, and to what extent they were kind of doing something in between. And for me, the title, How the Word is Passed, comes from one of the first places I went was Monticello Plantation, which is Thomas Jefferson's home in Virginia. And they've done a lot of work on trying to excavate the histories and stories of the enslaved people who were held there. Thomas Jefferson owned over 600 enslaved people over the course of his lifetime. And part of what is so fascinating about Monticello is that they're such an incredible example of how, if you are a historical site or a museum, that the story you told yourself about yourself, or the story you told the world about yourself, 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago, doesn't have to be the same story you tell about yourself today. That you can learn about your own history and recognize that you have a set of responsibilities to tell a set of stories that maybe you hadn't told.
And, just before. The way you said that, that's also a description of a life where you are growing more mature and more wise, right?
Absolutely.
You and I wouldn't tell the same. And I'm almost 30 years older than you, but I would tell a completely different story of myself now than I would have 20, 30, 40
absolutely.
years ago.
And I think sometimes we think about that feels intuitive for us with regard to individuals.
Yeah.
But I think what I wanted to convey in part in the chapter about Monticello is that institutions can do it too.
Yeah, I think it's human. It is the same pattern at the collective level that it is at the individual level.
It is, and so the descendants, they have something called the Getting Word Oral History Project, in which the public historian and researchers at Monticello look for people who are the descendants of folks who were enslaved at Monticello. And I was reading an interview with one of the descendants, and he has a phrase where he talks about because Black people and enslaved people were systemically prevented from learning how to read and write. And so there was very little literacy. And so there's not a lot of written documentation. And this is a broader issue with the sort of historiography of slavery more broadly, is that so many of the primary source documents we have are from enslavers, but we have very little from enslaved people because they weren't allowed to read and write. But what we do have are stories. What we do have are oral histories that have been passed down through generations. And one of the descendants of someone who was enslaved at Monticello said, this is how the word is passed down. And you kind of have these moments as a writer where you see the title, and it's almost like you're reading something, you're reading this long transcript, and it just kind of like stars start to sparkle around it.
Yeah. And again, it's like the word. It's the word. It's so much more than a word, right? It is the reality. It is right. It is the truth that is being passed. There's something so interesting about the arc of this pilgrimage and the book. It feels to me like at some point you kind of personally went through the same kind of transition in yourself that you made with your students all those years ago. That you went to all these places and you kind of looked at the history from all these different directions. And you ended up going back to your own grandparents at the end of the journey. You wrote, I had forgotten that the best primary sources are often sitting right next to us. I thought that was, I don't know, I wonder, and I feel like you asked them, you have two living grandparents, and I thought you asked them questions that you'd never asked them before. And I wonder if you would just share a little bit of maybe some of what you learned that you were astonished you'd never heard or known or internalized before.
Yeah, I'd visited all of these places, dozens of places, many of which didn't end up in the book, but certainly informed the way I wrote about the places that did end up in the book. And I ended up going, I did have this sort of realization that, I've spent these years traveling across the country, across an ocean, because I also went to West Africa, asking strangers, people I had never met and people that I may never see again, to tell me these personal, in-depth, intimate stories about their lives and their histories. And I realized that I was doing so with a level of intentionality that I had never brought to my own family. And so it felt incumbent upon me to bring that same sort of energy that I was bringing to, a tour guide at Monticello, or to a Confederate reenactor at a Confederate cemetery in Virginia, or to the descendant of the person who founded Juneteenth in Galveston, Texas. That I asked those same sort of questions to the people who have been around me my entire life. And so I ended up going to the National Museum of African American History and Culture with my grandparents. My grandfather born in 1930, Jim Crow, Mississippi, and my grandmother born in 1939, Jim Crow, Florida. And we're walking through the museum, and I'm pushing my grandfather in his wheelchair. His cane is laid across his lap. And my grandmother's walking a few paces ahead of us. And I have this moment where I'm looking at them, look at the exhibits in this museum, and realizing that so many of the things that are documented in this museum are things that they experienced firsthand.
Yeah.
And I talked to my grandmother after the museum, after we left, and she kept using this refrain. She kept saying, I lived it.
Yeah.
I lived it.
Yeah.
I lived it.
Yeah.
And I think about the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a woman named Ruth Bonner, who sort of rang the bell to signal the opening of the museum alongside the Obama family in 2016. And she was the daughter of an enslaved person.
Yeah.
not the granddaughter, not the great-granddaughter, the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2016 was the daughter of a man who was born into slavery. As I said, like my grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So when my 6-year-old or my 4-year-old sit on my grandfather's lap, I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap. And I'm just reminded that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago. It just wasn't that long ago at all. People talk about...
We can literally touch it.
There are people alive today who knew, who loved, who were raised by people who were born into American chattel slavery. And so the idea that anyone would suggest that this history has nothing to do with our contemporary landscape of inequality, the idea that anyone would suggest that it has nothing to do with what our social, political, and economic infrastructure in this country look like, is being morally and intellectually disingenuous. Because this history and the scope of human history was just yesterday.
And I think the contribution you're helping to make to this reckoning that is before us, just to this telling of the truth, is also to help. There's this phrase that recurs in your writing, in the marrow of our bones, right? It's this phrase in English. So we feel something in your gut. You feel it in the marrow of your bones, and it's actually language that points at how we're learning how emotion and memory actually work, that they are embedded physically. But it's like the language, it's like the words knew it before we had the science for it. And I feel like, we are in this time of where, there are all these levels that we have to bring forward, right? We do have to bring forward the ideas and the stories and the history and the facts and all of that. But there's also this level of us being able to internalize it as a human level, whoever we are, on whatever side of this history our ancestors stood and participated. And I feel like that's thing we're talking about here, this connection between word and story and embodied reality. It's like, I feel like that's what your work kind of helps people. It helps it sink into that level. I wondered if you would read, I was also so struck with that, how your grandmother kept saying, I lived it. And I wondered if you would read in How the Word Was Passed, this section in the epilogue, kind of at the end of that, where starting with on page 287. This is also a good example of poetry as narrative nonfiction, I feel. It's the paragraph that starts, a silence settled between us. And then going through to the end of that section on the next page, what I heard was, I'm still alive.
A silence settled between us, and I kept thinking about her refrain. I lived it. I lived it. I lived it. It echoed throughout the room and became the gravity around us. It crept into my ears and made a home in there. I watched the realization wash over her like a tide had risen around her body. There was so much I had not known about my grandmother's life until this moment. So many painful experiences that she still carried deep in the marrow of her bones. I thought of how easily these memories might have slipped away from her had we not sat down. These stories might have remained grains of sand at the bottom of an hourglass. I thought about all the ways the world today is at once so different and not so different at all. The exhibits at the museum were not abstractions for my grandparents. They were affirmations that what they had experienced was not of their imagination, and harrowing reminders that the scars of that era had not been self-inflicted. When my grandmother said, I lived it, what I heard was, this museum is a mirror. When my grandmother said, I lived it, what I heard was, my memories are an exhibit of their own. When my grandmother said, I lived it, what I heard was, always remember what this country did to us. When my grandmother said, I lived it, what I heard was, don't let them tell you we didn't fight back. When my grandmother said, I lived it, what I heard was, I did not die. I have somehow made it here when so many did not. I escaped the jaws of a cruel thing and lived to tell this story. When my grandmother said I lived it, what I heard was, I am still alive.
That's an incredible passage. When I was reading that, I was also feeling like, as a writer, that I mean, I don't know, I may be imagining. I just feel like that must have been an incredible few paragraphs for you to write.
Yeah, it's I just never done anything like that before. I just had never. You spend your time, you spend your whole life surrounded by someone, surrounded by people you love. And then you realize that you've only ever known like a very brief part of their story. And I think that it's something I tell educators all the time now. I mean, if I had a magic wand, other than paying teachers much more money than they make and, giving schools all the resources they need, if I had a magic education wand, I would wish that every history and social studies class would have students interview their elders, whether it be their parents
Wonderful.
or their grandparents or their great-grandparents or the
neighbor.
The neighbor
Yeah.
who, is always sitting on her porch.
Yeah.
I mean, I just understood, I feel like I understood my grandparents in a way that I simply couldn't have otherwise. And I remember, talking to my grandmother and as she described, what she was subjected to and there's this moment where she talks about how as a little girl, she's walking to school on the sort of red clay in Florida. And these white students are passing by on a bus and they start to spit at her. They start to throw food at her. And they call her the N-word. And, there's this woman who is a sort of magisterial figure in my life, who is sort of the embodiments of grace and elegance and generosity and kindness. You suddenly, it's not this, 80-something-year-old woman sitting in front of me anymore. Suddenly it's this 9-year-old girl. And it, we kind of have these recurring things that keep coming up in our conversation, but like it allowed me to see the humanity of my grandmother.
Yeah, right.
And the totality of her and the complexity of her in a different way. And the same thing with my grandfather. And I feel very lucky to have been able to have these conversations with them.
Yeah.
And, I only wish that I had the opportunity to have had this conversation with their respective spouses before they passed away.
I found as I was reading into you that you and I have a shared something we're interested in, which is this question of public memory. And I'm currently writing a book about that involves Germany. I spent most of my 20s, most of the 1980s in divided Berlin, and am also pondering how I saw that country reckoning with its history 40 years on from the war. And now 40 years from that, and being able to look at that entire arc, and also being so aware of myself in my 20s in Germany and the grappling they were doing with that burden of history was very messy at that point and complicated, but it was ever present, right? It was in every conversation. It was in every room. And I'm so struck at how I was so, both to them and to myself, was from this much more innocent country, right? Like they were from the country that had this crushing guilt of history, and I was from the country as we all understood it, and had all learned it from that, wasn't perfect, but was always getting better. And you ask a question that is similar to a question I keep finding myself asking as I'm looking back at across these 75, 80 years, how the Germans have wrestled with this. You also note the Germans were walked through the camps, right? They were walked through the concentration camps. They were made to bear witness. They were made to remember. There's a lot of complexity to how the whole world was also watching for them to grapple with this history. But it has occurred to me, and I feel like you asked a very similar question, if there were these concentrated places of where this atrocity had happened in a concentration of years, but lynchings were kind of town by town and tree by tree. There's no single place to walk through. There's not that concentration of place and of years, but there's an accumulation across many generations. And what would be our equivalent, right, of that kind of reckoning that they've done? Just kind of free-flowing with you.
Yeah. No, that's it's an important question, and one that I've been thinking about a lot.
Yeah.
And then thinking about a lot now as I'm working on a book project that has sort of grown out of my trip to Germany. And my trip to Germany grew out of my examination of, monuments, memorials here in the United States. And I wanted to understand how, Germany is often lifted up, as the sort of exemplar of memory, an exemplar of a nation state that has accounted for and has come to terms with, that has demonstrated a sense of regret for what they've done and what they did during the Holocaust and World War II more broadly. And so I went there because I wanted to understand what that looked like.
Yeah.
And as I'm sure probably even better than me, having lived there for so long, it is not a singular story.
No.
It is not a story of like, wow, Germany is so great at this, like we should be like Germany, which I think is how sometimes in the United States the narrative exists, right? I think sometimes from this vantage point, people look at Germany and say, why don't we just do it like Germany?
Yeah.
Why don't we, without thinking about the complexities and the unevenness and the sense of disagreement that exists among communities in Germany about how this has been done. But I think one of the things that motivated me, there's this essay that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about his trip that he took to Warsaw, Poland in 1949. And, Du Bois is the most preeminent Black scholar of the day, perhaps of all time. He is someone who spent his life thinking about the specific contours and manifestation of anti-Blackness in the United States. And he goes to Warsaw, and he goes to the land where the former Warsaw Ghetto, where the Warsaw Uprising happened. And he's standing on this land where thousands of Jewish people fought back against the Nazis. He's standing in this country where 3 million Jewish people were killed. 98% of the Jewish population in Poland killed in a matter of years. And he's standing there, and he's like, I've stood on the land where the KKK has burned crosses. I have stood under the trees where Black bodies have been lynched. I have worked my entire life thinking about this question of what white people in America do to Black people and how we can overcome it. But he talks about how he never experienced the kind of feeling that he did when he was standing on that land in Warsaw. And he talks about how it stripped him of a sort of what he calls a sense of social provincialism. And it expanded his his understanding of the interrelatedness between anti-Blackness in the United States and anti-Semitism in Europe, and allowed him to more fully understand the global contours of state-sanctioned violence and all the various forms that it takes on. And I feel like I've had a very similar experience. Like, that's what going to Berlin and going to Munich, going to Dachau, like, that's what those experiences were for me. I mean, I've stood on plantations, I've stood in execution chambers, I've stood, put my hand on the poles where enslaved people were held, where they were beaten within an inch of their lives. I put my hands in the soil where lynchings happened. But the feeling I felt when I stood in a gas chamber in Dachau was unlike anything that I had ever experienced before. And I think it was a very sort of Du Boisian moment for me, because I think it also expanded my understanding of the interrelatedness and the relationship between, the various forms of violence that happened in different geopolitical contexts, and expanded almost my historical empathy. It made me feel more proximate to that history. It made that history more intimate. It made it less of a historical abstraction and more real, more tactile, more personal. And I think that for me, that is why this has become a sort of larger project for me, whether it be in the context of slavery or in the context of World War II or anything else. There's something about putting your body in the place where history happened,
right,
that reduces the gap between you and that period of time, that creates this sort of temporal proximity.
Gosh, I feel like
between you and that history.
That's such a strong summation, I think, of the core of this work as you do it. I mean, I do also, though, I want to just raise up this very stunning and shameful reality that you also have lifted up in the context of this discussion, that Angola prison, which is also a place of pilgrimage for you, I would say, is built on the land of a former plantation. And you have pointed out that in the book, if in Germany today there were a prison built on top of a former concentration camp, and that prison disproportionately incarcerated Jewish people, it would provoke outrage throughout the world. This is not something that is in American awareness.
It's not. And I think it reflects a failure of our collective memory around what slavery was, and the sort of reverberations of how it continues to shape our lives today. The scholar Sadai Hartman, she talks about this idea of the afterlife of slavery, how the sort of reverberations, the residue, the ripples of slavery continue to shape so much of what our world and our society looks like today. And oftentimes I think we fail, and we have failed for many times, and that is not by accident. It is reflective of an intentional effort to prevent a collective remembrance of what slavery was, in the mid-19th, early 20th century via the Lost Cause, which distorted our collective sense of what happened during enslavement, what happened during the Civil War, what the Civil War was even fought about, to the point where you have, there was a study not too long ago that talked about how, most high school seniors, when asked what the Civil War was about, only a small handful of them said slavery.
Yeah, that was shocking to me.
And, all you have to do is look at the declarations of Confederate secession, where a state like Mississippi in 1861 says, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world." So they're not vague about why they're seceding from the Union. They're very clear about it. But again, part of what I learned in this journey is that for so many people, history is not about primary source documents or empirical evidence. It's a story that they're told, and it's a story that they tell. It's an heirloom that's passed down across generations. It's something where loyalty to an idea, to a family, to a community, to a sense of self takes precedence over truth. And I think that prevents us from collectively remembering what slavery was in a way that would prevent us from building a prison on top of land that was once a plantation, a prison that disproportionately, in which 70% of the people who are held there are Black men, and 70% of the people held there are serving life sentences. And, in a way that we would never allow in a different geopolitical context.
Right.
So there's a specific sort of American failure that allows that place to exist in that way.
And just, again, I mean, even just the way you said that, it gets again at how language ultimately builds worlds, shapes worlds and sustains worlds. Do you have we started a couple minutes late. Can we go a few minutes after?
Yeah, I have time.
Okay. So as we, there's so much I'd like to talk to you about. I wanted, you are now the father of 2 children, of young children, and in this world. And of course, parenting is the ultimate whole body, whole mind, whole spirit occupation. Word, deed, thought, and emotion are all just utterly physical. You've written, "My children are both respite from all the tragedy transpiring in the world and a reminder of how high the stakes are." I wonder if you'd say some more about that.
Yeah, I think about these trips that I took when I was writing How the Word is Passed, and we were just talking about Angola. I think about how I would come back from Angola or come back from the Whitney plantation, or come back from the Confederate cemetery, or come back from Monticello, and I'd be inevitably in all of these places, and I think it comes up in the book. Part of what I think about are my own kids, and going back to what we mentioned earlier in the conversation, this sort of arbitrary nature of birth and circumstance. I think it applies when examining like contemporary realities, but also thinking about history, right? Like that I just happened to be born at a specific period in time, and that had I been born 20, 50, 100, 150 years ago, the nature of my life would have been fundamentally different than it is today. And I think about that both in the context of myself, but also in the context of my children. Yeah. So, when I leave the Whitney plantation and I spent time standing in a cabin where enslaved people lived. I spent time walking through the fields enslaved people worked in. I spent time looking at the names of enslaved children who didn't make it past their fifth birthday. I think of my kids, and I think about what responsibility I have to them, to tell these stories and to honor these histories, so they have a better sense of who they are in relationship to their history, but also so this country can better situate the lives of my children and the lives of each of us more accurately and more humanely. And so I'll be thinking about that, and then I would come home and I open the door. And, I think when I came back from there, maybe my kids were 3 and 1. And, I open the door and my 3-year-old, they don't, he doesn't say like, "Man, Dad, like, come sit down, like have a cup of tea. It seems like you're processing a lot right now. You just had this really profound and traumatic and jarring experience. Like, let's sit, let's process this." No, I come through the door and he's like, where you been? Like, get on the ground and be a brachiosaurus.
Yeah.
Like, it's time to play. And I'm so grateful for those moments like that, where my kids sort of take me out of my own head.
Yeah.
My kids have made me a much sillier person. They've made me a more present person, which isn't to say it happened automatically. I think I had to proactively remind myself to sit in that presence, and not to simply allow the things that are sort of moving through my head all the time to preoccupy me, so that, to the point that I don't fully appreciate what's directly in front of me.
I want to ask you a couple more questions about this and then ask you to read some more poems. But I wonder if just right here, if you would read this ode to those first 15 minutes after the kids fall asleep, which is in the Above Ground book. Because this is just so like, before you're a parent, the meaning of bedtime, getting to bedtime and post bedtime.
Oh man,
It's page 101.
You don't fully appreciate like how sleep deprivation is a terror, or like a torture tactic, until you have kids. So the poem that precedes this is Ode to Bedtime, and then this one is Ode to those first 15 minutes after the kids are finally asleep. Praise the couch that welcomes you back into its embrace, as it does every night around this time. Praise the loose cereal that crunches beneath your weight, the whole grain golden dust that now shimmers on the backside of your pants. Praise the cushion, the one in the middle that sinks like a lifeboat leaking air, and the ottoman covered in crayon stains that you have now accepted as aesthetic. Praise your knees, and the evening respite they receive from a day of choo-choo training along the carpet with 2 eager passengers in tow. Praise the silence. Oh, the silence. How it washes over you like a warm bedsheet. Praise the walls for the way they stand there and don't ask for anything. Praise the seduction of slumber that tiptoes across your eyelids, the way it tempts you to curl up right there and drift away even though it's only 7:30 p.m. Praise the phone you scroll through, without even realizing that you're scrolling. Praise the video you scroll past of the man teaching his dog how to dance merengue. Praise the way it makes you laugh, the way someone laughs when they are so tired they don't know if they will ever stand up again. Praise the toys scattered across the floor, the way you wonder if it might be okay to just leave them there for now, since you know that tomorrow they will simply end up there again.
So, this phrase, like what I want for my children, what we want for our children, I wonder, given how much you're steeped in the language we use communally, the work we're doing and not doing communally, the way we educate and impart knowledge around American history and the history of slavery and our racial identities and, who we can be to each other in this future. How would you start to talk about what I want for my children in this regard?
I want them. I just want them to be joyous. I want them to be joyous, and I want them to recognize the sort of larger responsibility that they have, which is to say, I think all the time about how the first enslaved people who came to this country, they came to the British colonies that would become the United States in 1619. Slavery wasn't eradicated until 1865, formally anyway. But what's also true is that from the moment enslaved people arrived on these shores, they were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for emancipation. They were fighting for liberation. And what that means is that the majority of people who fought for freedom never got a chance to experience for themselves. But so many of them fought for it anyway, because they knew that someday someone would. And I think about how my life is only possible, how my children's lives are only possible because of generations of people who fought for something they knew they might never see, but who fought for it anyway because they knew that someday someone would. And I want my children to recognize that. I want them to hold that. I want them to sit with that, not in a way that's meant to overwhelm them, not in a way that's meant to cause them despair, but in a way that is meant to help them accurately situate themselves in this sort of long lineage, this long historical arc that they are a part of. And to remember that that is a part of what should animate how we move through the world and what decisions we make and how we treat people and what we work toward. And that does not come at the exclusion of or the expense of joy and love and laughter and levity. But, part of what I think about all the time is the simultaneity of the human experience, how our lives are both defined by that love, that joy, that laughter, but also defined by anxiety, fear, despair, and somewhere between those is, I think, a responsibility, right? Both recognizing the truth of our past and all that has preceded us, not in a way that's meant to paralyze us or overwhelm us or trap us in a sense of despair, but in a way that is meant to help us recognize and remember our own agency.
Yeah. And I feel like the way you're describing that would also be true of what you would want for the white children that they're growing up with.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's what I want for, it's what I want for my children, but it's what I want for all children. It's what I want for all of us. It's what I want all of us to understand that what our lives look like are only because of people who've created the circumstances that have given rise to our lives today, and in ways that are generative and wonderful, and in ways that we're grateful for, and in ways that we recognize are profoundly unjust, and in ways that are profoundly unfair, and in ways that should not exist in the way that they do. And I think it's about holding and recognizing and sitting with both of those, and figuring out how we move forward collectively.
So just one more question before I ask you to read some poems. Just kind of circling back to this inquiry in our life together with this technology that is going to reshape so much. It's somehow going to shape these reckonings we're in. And this question of what intelligence is. I just wonder, as you live with these new humans in your life and you see them grow and learn organically, how would you think about how they expand your understanding of the fullness of what intelligence is in a human life, in a human body?
I think that intelligence comes in multiple forms. I when I was in graduate school, I was, at an institution where there were scholars thinking about this idea of sort of multiple intelligences, and the way that, how important it was for us to move away from a sort of myopic singular definition of what intelligence looked like or what constitutes as being smart, and to recognize that exists in all sort of different ways for all sorts of different people. And so I want my kids to understand that for themselves, to understand that for for how they understand and observe people, and make sense of other people in the world. And I want them to recognize that the way that we tell the story of our world can take on so many different forms, and that there are so many different ways to learn about the world that they live in, that exists beyond, and this is all almost going back to some of the questions that I was thinking about my prison work, is that there's like and also, in the context of my teaching of high school, which I guess it's a through line through my life and my work, but that education is not something that just happens in formal settings, that the cultivation of intelligence is not something that only happens in formal settings, or that can manifest itself on through specific metrics or on a specific test. But it's far more vast and far more expansive and far more beautiful and kaleidoscopic than the way that we have understood it. And so I want my kids' definitions of themselves and definitions of others to be as broad and expansive and kaleidoscopic as we know the world is.
Yeah. So I have chosen 4 poems I'd love for you to read. If there's anything you want to read, I'd love that. One of them actually is, you touched, especially in these last few minutes, on this fact of what is terrible and what is potentially more generative coexisting, and that it's not that even having hope or seeing agency to reshape the world is not to be able to unsee what makes no sense. It's not to be able to tie it up. There's a poem in Above Ground. We have made it through worse before, page 12. I found this one helpful because I feel this way a lot myself.
Yeah, I oftentimes the poems I write almost serve as like memos to myself. Almost a kind of like sometimes you need to write something down. This is, the voice in my head being like, sometimes you need to write something down to remind you of its truth, to hold you accountable. So as much as this poem says, like, begins when people say we have made it through worse before, it could very easily say when I have said we will make it through worse before, or something that I am implicated. What I'm trying to say is that I am also implicated in the people.
Right.
Here.
Right.
And I think that that's the case for so many of my poems. I'm rarely trying to singularly look outwards when making sort of societal observations, without also recognizing the way that I am complicit in, or indicted in, or part of the very thing that I am critiquing or examining or wrestling with. And I think that that's absolutely the case here. When people say we have made it through worse before, all I hear is the wind slapping against all the gravestones of those who did not make it, those who did not survive to see the confetti fall from the sky, those who did not live to watch the parade roll down the street. I have grown accustomed to a lifetime of aphorisms, meant to assuage my fears, pithy sayings meant to convey that all ends up fine in the end. But there is no solace in rearranging language to make a different word tell the same lie. Sometimes the moral arc of the universe does not bend in a direction that comforts us. Sometimes it bends in ways we don't expect, and there are people who fall off in the process. Please, dear reader, do not say that I am hopeless. I believe there is a better future to fight for. I simply accept the possibility that I may not live to see it. I've grown weary of telling myself lies that I might one day begin to believe. We are not all left standing after the war has ended. Some of us have become ghosts by the time the dust has settled.
And I wonder also in this book, this Above Ground book, which is your most recent book, it's another poem about New Orleans, another kind of documenting your ongoing grappling with that. Such deep roots that city has in you. Here nor there, page 41.
Here nor there. I've tried to write these poems before. You know, the ones about the infamous storm and its majestic violence, the floodwater that swallowed a city then sat still as night. I think often of the things it took from us that we'll never know we could have had. Nostalgia is a well-intentioned wound. Counterfactuals are a bed of thorns in a room with nowhere else to lay your head. I imagine what could have been, but never was. The Christmases with my children, in the home where I once opened presents, kicking a soccer ball with my daughter against the same playground where I imagined a life of goals and glory. That home is now silent as a sky of smoke. That wall is no longer a wall, but a pile of wood in a lonely field. I tremble at what I already know, that my children will not know the city beyond the holidays and funerals that bring them here. That I no longer know this city I have always worn like a tattoo. I still remember the city as something it was kept from becoming. I am still looking for a language that is not covered in mud.
Gosh, that last line, I'm still looking for a language not covered in mud. And also, nostalgia is a well-intentioned wound. So maybe just the final one that I pulled out, which feels like a good way to end just with this back and forth of what is terrible and and what is beautiful, and how they exist and are always in interplay with each other. This was from the first, from Counting Descent, page 56, No More Elegies Today. But I do want to ask if there's anything you want to read that, if you feel like this isn't a full, and I feel like I'm really keeping you, and this is heroic now at this point, this interview.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Page 56.
Maybe I'll read.
Yeah, is there another one you'd like to read?
I think because we've been talking about the sort of, we've been talking about a lot of heavy stuff, but I also, want to name and reaffirm like the joy and the levity and the laughter. So I was thinking maybe a dance party.
Yep.
But I can read that after No More Elegies.
Okay.
No more elegies today. Today I will write a poem about a little girl jumping rope. It will not be a metaphor for dodging bullets. It will not be an allegory for skipping past despair, but rather about the back and forth bob of her head as she waits for the right moment to insert herself into the blinking flashes of bound hemp, but rather about her friends on either end of the rope who turn their wrist into small flashing windmills, cultivating an energy of their own, but rather about the way the beads in her hair bounce against the back of her neck, but rather the way her feet barely touch the ground, how the rope skipping across the concrete sounds like the entire world is giving her a round of applause. It's so interesting. I haven't read this poem in a while.
Taking you down memory lane.
Well, it's interesting. I wrote this before, many years before my daughter was born.
Yeah.
And I, I think about the beads in her own hair now.
Yeah.
We were
the round of applause that the world is giving her.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it's like imagining her in that.
Yeah.
Let's see.
I see it on page 89. Is that right? In Above Ground Dance Party?
Yes. So, I talked about how For me, poetry is the act of paying attention, the act of capturing a moment, a feeling. And, a lot of what we've talked about has been on the heavier side, and things that have been capturing those moments, observations, feelings, histories that might elicit anxiety, despair, fear, or speak to violence or oppression. But that's only part of the human experience. And there are other parts that are worthy of our attention and our gratitude. And one of those things for me is that we have dance parties after we finish our dinner sometimes in our house. And it's a delight. Unfortunately, my children have no rhythm, which is like, it's fine for a 6 and a 4-year-old, but if it continues through their adolescence, it'll be devastating for all of us. So to everybody listening, please pray for my my rhythmless children, that they can get it together. But this poem is called Dance Party. Sometimes in the evenings after dinner, after the spaghetti has been slurped and I have bribed the broccoli into their bellies, I give both of my children the look. When my eyes meet theirs, they know what time it is. They push in their chairs, they stretch their legs, and we move the table to the far end of the dining room to clear space for what we all know is coming. Alexa, play the post-dinner dance party playlist. And within seconds, Martha Wash's booming voice rolls like thunder over our bodies. Everybody dance now. The electronic keyboard and the drums meet in the middle of the room like two dinosaurs ready to claim the kitchen as their own. Immediately the jumping begins, and my daughter is flinging her limbs like an offbeat octopus, hands slapping the air behind her as if she is trying to smack anyone who enters her sacred space. I turn around and my son is doing the robot, or is being eaten by a robot, or is trapped in a universe where robots take over the bodies of little boys in peanut butter pajamas. Nonetheless, there is a robot somewhere, and my children, bless them, have not yet learned how to clap on the 2 and 4, so I laugh but also cringe as their small hands make a mockery of the melody around them. Now, halfway through the song, everyone is jumping, and I, caught up in the ecstasy of this moment, fall to the ground and convince this no longer young body that it is a good idea to start doing the worm. And when my children see me, their eyes become pools of possibility, and it is clear they see this as a clarion call to climb onto my back. And now, here we are, this strange trifecta, this unlikely trio, a robot and an octopus riding on the back of a worm who will certainly need some Tylenol before bed. And it is in this moment that their mother comes home. And when she opens the door, everyone is screaming. The speakers are blasting, and the percussion is shaking every wall around us. We look up at her, and she looks down at us, and we have no explanation for this strange scene, only an invitation for her to join.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for all that you do and for this beautiful conversation. We'll be producing it in the next few weeks, and we'll let you know well in advance. And yeah, it's just been a joy to talk to you. Maybe someday we can have coffee and talk about Germany.
I would love that. Are you on the West Coast?
I'm in Minnesota, but I get to the East Coast a lot.
Okay. Well, yeah, please look me up.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for all the time. I had way too many notes. I still had to skip over all kinds of things I thought we would talk about. But I just really appreciate it. It's thank you. Thank you.
No, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay. Blessings.
Bye-bye.